Okay, so it's the time now. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to you, Professor Chen. Welcome to the Innovation in Linguistics talk series, proudly presented by the journal Cognitive Semantics. It's my great pleasure to host the 20th lecture in this series today. Thank you all for joining us. Before we begin, allow me to offer a brief introduction to both our journal and our distinguished speaker. Cognitive Semantics, abbreviated as COSE, is a peer-reviewed international journal dedicated to investigating the complex relationship between meaning and the human mind. We welcome original research from all theoretical perspectives within linguistics. 2025 marks a milestone for us. Cognitive Semantics is now a diamond open access journal. So this means that both authors and readers enjoy completely free access with no publication or subscription fees. We are deeply grateful to Beihang University, Beijing 航空航天大学, for providing generous support to make this possible. Articles are published online on a rolling basis immediately upon editorial acceptance. Our founding editor and editor-in-chief is Professor Fuyin Thomas Lee of Beihang University. We are honored to have world-renowned scholars among our consulting editors, including George Lakoff, Roland Nangaker, and Leland Telmi. Our review editor is Professor Ed Fuyin, and our associate editors are Dylan Glenn, Martin Hilpert, and Francisco Jose Reyes de Mendoza. The editorial team is supported by my wonderful colleagues Gao Zerong, Li Zifan, Yang Yuhang from Beihang University, and myself from Central China Normal University. As we celebrate the 20th lecture in this series, I'm delighted to let you know that recordings of our previous 19 lectures are available on our WeChat platform and YouTube channel, so feel free to explore. Today, we are honored to welcome Professor Chen Jidong, Chair and Professor of Linguistics at California State University, Fresno. Professor Chen earned her PhD in linguistics in 2008 from the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics and the Free University Amsterdam. Her research explores both children and adults, their acquisition of language, and how language interacts with cognition. Professor Chen has worked extensively on topics such as the acquisition of syntax and semantics across languages, the influence of language features like classifier systems on online processing, and the role of speech and co-speech gestures in shaping how events are represented and construed across speakers of various languages, including Arabic, English, Mandarin, and Spanish. Today's lecture is titled The Acquisition of Four Meaning Mappings Across Linguistic Perspective. We are very look forward to hearing her insights. So Professor Chen, thank you again for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction. Thank you everyone for joining me getting up early on a Sunday morning. Thank you to Cognitive Semantics and Professor Lee for inviting me to speak. It's a great honor and pleasure. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen before I start to talk about the acquisition of four meaning mappings.
Yes, we can see the cover now.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a fundamental issue in child language, the acquisition of format meaning mappings from a cross-linguist perspective. So the roadmap for today's talk, in the next 90 minutes or so, I hope I'll cover the following topics. I will start with a brief introduction to the acquisition of four meaning mappings in child language. Then I'll present empirical research with colleagues in a few areas concerning this issue. The first area is in event encoding and categorization, in particular in the semantic field of material destruction, cutting, breaking, and tearing events for short. The second area of research goes beyond word-to-event mapping and focuses on information structure and processing factors that shape speakers' and learners' selection of correct forms, including phrases, sentence structures, and word orders. Specifically, I'll present our research on word order in conjunct noun phrases and word order variation in speakers' syntactic choices as a factor of processing factors such as accessibility. The third area concerns the interface of semantics and syntax, how verb arguments are realized in child language as modulated by processing factors. I will conclude my talk with directions for future research in this area. Okay, so you may be very familiar with this timeline. It's a very rough timeline of typically developing children's early language development from prenatal stage to near adult competence in the first few years of life. During these critical early years of life for language acquisition, healthy children usually start to babble around 6 months of age and produce their first words around 12 to 14 months of age. Combination of words into sentences and grammatical competence continue to grow in the next few years. By around preschool or early school age 5 to 6 years, children usually reach the adult competence in their first language. So in this process, when the child acquires a language, a lot of things need to be acquired. First of all, among many things, they need to learn words and their meanings. For example, to express a simple concept such as a rabbit, English speakers can use the word rabbit or bunny, and Chinese speakers, 兔子. Such linguistic forms pick out a range of very different reference that may share some distinctive features such as, for example, forelegs, furry, long ears. These distinctive features can distinguish a rabbit from other words such as a dog or cat. So to build this correct mappings between meanings and words, children are facing at least two problems. Problem number one, the identification problem. Children need to identify the reference meanings of the words. For example, a concrete noun is usually mapped onto an object, a verb onto a relation between two entities, for example, an agent and a patient. The identification problem has been famously illustrated by Quine in his example of the Gavagai problem. A rabbit scurries by and the native who speaks an unknown language says Gavagai. So what does Gavagai mean? This forms a special case of the induction problem. Given the context, the word Gavagai could have a lot of possible meanings. For example, it can refer to the animal, it can mean rabbit, rabbit's ear, fur, body, tail, or eye. It may also mean food source, yummy, cute, or the color of the fur. So how do children figure out what is the correct reference meaning of a simple word such as gavak? The second problem is the categorization problem. Children need to figure out the meanings and words when these words can be referring to a lot of very, very different objects or members of the same categories that can be used with the same word. So for example, nouns usually pick out categories of objects. A simple word like rabbit selects a range of infinite number of rabbits that could look very different in the real world in terms of color, the size, the shape, etc. Verbs are even more complex. Verbs and predicates usually pick out categories of relationships between entities. For example, a simple verb such as push, it can refer to an infinite number of events of pushing that involve a pusher, the agent, and an entity being pushed, the patient. The agents and the patients for pushing can all look very different physically in the real world. So to talk about their experiences of events, children have to figure out this mapping between their non-linguistic cognitive representations of events and the corresponding linguistic representations. To do so, they need to parse the ongoing perceptual flow into units that are relevant to the target language. They have to figure out how these conceptual units are instantiated in perceptually very different recurrent object or event types associated with different linguistic forms in their language. Despite the complexity of identification and categorization problems, children have been found to be pretty good at mapping forms onto their meanings after hearing it used only once or twice. This is known as fast mapping, a cognitive process by which children quickly form an initial association between a new word and its meaning after some minimal exposure. So how do children do that? What is the underlying cognitive learning mechanism? One theoretical question has been widely debated. What is the role of non-linguistic concepts in learning form meaning mappings? Two contrasting views have been proposed in the field. The first one, the cognitive priority. According to this view, the categories associated with everyday words are largely universal and originate from non-linguistic cognition shaped by perceptual and cognitive predispositions, environmental and biological constraints, and activities common to people everywhere. Acquiring words is a process of mapping them onto concepts that have already been established on a non-linguistic basis. The alternative view argues lexical categories do not reflect shared non-linguistic cognition directly, but are to some extent linguistic conventions that are free to vary according to historical, cultural, and environmental circumstances. Learning words, even for seemingly universal human experiences and activities, often involves working out language-specific principles of categorization. The cross-linguistic investigation of semantic categories has a very long history. A number of semantic domains have been widely investigated in the past 2 decades, including, for example, spatial domain, motion events, events of material destruction, and object domains, object categories, temporal domain, placements, events, etc. So today I'm going to focus on collaborative work in the semantic domain of material destruction, cutting, breaking, and tearing events. I will talk about 3 languages, Mandarin Chinese, Zhaocao, a Mexican Mayan language, and Tamil, a Dravidian language spoken in India. I'll show data in both child and adult speech from these 3 languages, talking about cutting, breaking, and tearing events. So in this domain, a lot of studies have shown that languages vary in systematic ways on how words are mapped onto linguistic concepts. Taking a simple breaking event, breaking a bar of chocolate, for example, English speakers can use a simple verb, break, to describe this event. She broke the bar of chocolate. In Mandarin Chinese, we can typically use a verb compound. 她掰断了巧克力. She bend, break the chocolate bar. So the first verb indicates the action of bending, and the second verb indicates the resultant state of the bending. In Zhaocao, the verb cas can be used to describe breaking a bar of chocolate. Cas, this verb is used only for breaking non-flexible long objects like stick, nail, tile, cornstalk, or tree blown down by wind. If the involved object is soft or flexible, for example, paper, tortilla, bread, leaves, etc., a different verb, het, has to be used. In Tamil, similar to English, a kind of generic break verb or die can be used to describe breaking a bar of chocolate. Recent research of a wide range of diverse languages have shown cross-linguistic variation in the number of categories and category boundaries, as well as agreement in the dimensions along which cutting and breaking are distinguished. In child language, variation and slow development of children's categories, for example, in holding and carry events, as well as in the development of object categories, have been observed. So why do we look into cutting and breaking events? As I have just briefly illustrated, there is consistent cross-linguistic variation in categorizing such events. Cut, break, tear, and their translation equivalents figure heavily in discussions of lexical and constructional semantics, but the core portion of their meanings are typically left unanalyzed and rendered as constants. For example, break means X cause Y become broken. What does it actually mean to cut or break or tear something for adult speakers of different languages and for their children? Cutting and breaking and tearing events are also universal and accessible to every culture. Learners of different languages encounter and begin to talk about these events very early on in life. Children have been found to make a lot of overextension errors in child speech. For example, in Barman's diary study, she noted overextension errors by learners of English. For example, a child at age 1 year, 8 months uttered break it to refer to an event of peeling a cooked noodle apart, or don't break my coat to refer to someone pulling on the back of her coat, me cutting to refer to an event of pulling pieces of peach apart with fingers. Such overextension errors may continue to a relatively old age in language acquisition. For example, the last example, a child at age 7 years, 6 months uttered, hey, I was about to cut mine, to refer to an event of cracking her nut with a hammer. So our research questions in this project include the following. What is the nature of variation in the semantic dimensions underlying adults' uses of cut, break, and tear verbs? Is there a universal learning pattern in the acquisition of form meaning mapping? To what extent do children's uses reflect that language-specific variation? Do children overextend or underextend event categories? To address these questions, we compared 3 languages, as I've mentioned earlier, Mandarin, Zhuangtao, and Tamil. So the speakers of these 3 languages participated in a listed production task. We had 10 children in Mandarin and Tamil, and 10 adults in Mandarin and 11 adults in Tamil. In Zhuangtao, we only had 5 4-year-olds and 8 6-year-olds and 5 adults. So each participant was asked to describe what happened in the stimuli. We had a total of 28 short video clips of cutting, breaking, and tearing events, which include familiar and unfamiliar cutting and breaking and tearing. So this is a graph showing you the still pictures from the video clips that we used in this illustration task. So the illustration was transcribed and verbs used to describe each stimulus were coded for analysis. Correspondence analysis was conducted to analyze the patterns. Correspondence analysis is a type of multivariate statistics techniques to visualize the relationship between the stimulus events and the verbs in multidimensional plots. Any 2 stimuli are similar to the extent that speakers describe them with the same verbs. Any 2 verbs are similar to the extent that they are mapped or used onto the same stimuli. For example, 2 stimuli that are described unanimously with the same verb are treated as completely similar and are plotted on top of each other in a multidimensional space. Conversely, 2 stimuli that no speakers describe with the same verb are completely dissimilar and are plotted maximally apart in the dimensional space. And 2 stimuli that are labeled with the same verb by some speakers but not by others are intermediate in terms of similarity. The similarity of the stimuli to each other and of the verbs to each other is represented in terms of physical closeness in the multidimensional space. the more similar to stimuli or to verbs are, the closer together they are plotted in the space. The relative importance of the dimensions that structure the multidimensional space is reflected in the order in which the dimensions are extracted. The first dimension captures the most variance among the stimulus events and verbs. The second dimension is the next most, and so on and so forth. So now I'm going to just present the results on the first two dimensions. These are the two dimensions that capture the most variance among the stimulus events and verbs. Okay, so this graph plots similarity of the events and verbs by Mandarin adult speakers. So I'm going to show you the adult patterns first, and then I'm going to show you the children's data. As you can see in this plot, the distance between the verbs and events indicate degree of similarity. So the physical distance between the verbs or the events can be visualized by the distance. In this plot, the numbers you see here indicate specific events, and the verbs are highlighted in circles. Okay, so as you can see, there are three distinct clusters of events and verbs. Dimension 1, as you can see this line here, it separates events of cutting with a blade instrument from events of breaking by hand. So bladed instruments versus by hand. And dimension 2 separates events of cutting with a single blade, for example, a knife, versus double blades, for example, scissors. And this graph shows you the similarity of events and verbs by the adult speakers. As you can see, dimension 1 distinguishes scenes of smashing from the rest. Dimension 2 shows a cluster of tearing, cutting, and breaking. So this pattern corroborates with Brown's 2007 study that there is no verb meaning cut in general or break in general, like in English. There's also a high variability in the verb usage across adults, as indicated by the closeness of these verbs and events. No clear clusters can be seen in the Zoto adult speech. Okay, so this graph plots both similarity of the events and verbs by Tamil adult speakers. Tamil adult speakers distinguish between breaking, tearing, and cutting. Dimension 1 distinguishes break verbs from the rest. And dimension 2 distinguishes tearing, cutting verbs and scenes. And just visually, these patterns, as we have seen, show that in these three different languages, tearing or separation of flex objects by hand tends to be distinguished from the other events across these three languages. Breaking and cutting are categorized in rather language-specific ways. So how do children categorize these events with verbs? So I'm going to show you the children's data in these three languages. So first, Mandarin children. These two graphs plot similarity of the events and verbs by Mandarin 4 and 6-year-olds. As you can see, Mandarin-speaking children categorize events with verbs similarly to their adults in event labeling and categories. They also show three clear clusters similar to adults. This usage suggests their early tuning to instrument, for example, blade versus hand, and the properties of objects. However, Mandarin children also show some differences in their use of verbs. For example, children use a generic verb, do verb, to describe breaking, cutting, or tearing, which never occurred in the adult speech. Children also vary from adults in the weighing of the dimensions. 4-year-olds are prioritized cutting with double blades versus breaking by hand or tearing. 6-year-olds prioritized cutting with a single blade, while adults prioritize blades versus hand on dimension 1. So these two graphs plot similarity of the events and verbs by Zhao Tao, 4 years, and 6-year-olds. As you can see, children are overall similar to adults in separating smashing events from the rest, even though these Zhao Tao children use the different smashing verb. Zhao Tao children vary from adults in a number of ways. They have distinct event or verb clusters. They also overextend verbs such as het and set. They also differed from adults on the perspective on events, for example, focusing on object properties, manner of motion, cutting, or the resultant state. So the last two graphs I'm showing here are Tamil's children's uses of the verbs to talk about cutting and breaking events. As you can see, Tamil speaking 4 and 6-year-olds also have distinct clusters of cut, break, and tear, similar to their adult counterparts. They also use the verb odai, break, and kizai, tear, in an adult-like manner. But unlike adults, they vary in their weighing of the dimensions. 4-year-olds distinguish tearing from the remaining things, whereas 6-year-olds distinguish cutting things along dimension 1. These children also overextended the verb usage the two. So to sum up the patterns you have seen, overall, children of each language pattern similarly to adults in distinguishing tearing type events. Children and adults tend to agree on the things for which a verb is most frequently used. Children homing on language-specific semantic dimensions at least by age 4 years of age. Children vary from adults in fine-grained semantic distinctions and the category boundaries. Our studies show that it can take children some time, for example, 6 years or longer, to learn to attend to adult semantic feature sets and to assign the features the appropriate weights. Children rely on powerful learning mechanisms to extract categorization patterns from a variable input, but later development is a gradual process involving considerable reorganization of semantic space. Okay, so now let's switch gear and move on to examine form and meaning mappings beyond lexical semantics. When learning a language, children also need to learn how to combine words according to the grammatical rules of the language. For example, to describe an event of a dog chasing a cat, children need to know how to place the words in the right order. It's ungrammatical to say chase dog cat to describe this event. English requires their speakers to say the cat chased the dog. These words have to be put in the subject verb object word order. In addition to the grammatical rules of a specific language, the choice and combination words into grammatical sentences are also subject to pragmatical needs and constraints. So in other words, children also need to figure out how to choose the right forms, words, and sentence structures to suit the communicative context. Given the same event of a dog chasing a cat, for example, it can be described as the dog chased the cat, or in Chinese, 那只狗在追那只猫, or it chased the cat, 它在追那只猫. So the arguments, the agent of the chasing action in this example can be realized with a full noun phrase, the dog, or with a pronoun, it. Also, speakers have the option of choosing a different syntactic structure or different word order to encode this event. Taking the same event, a dog chasing a cat, for example, we could say the dog chased the cat, or we could use a different word order. As for the cat, the dog was chasing it. So as view word order, subject, verb, object, or object, subject, verb. All languages give speakers options in terms of forms of words and also word order in terms of sentence structures. So what is community context? When we look at context, there are actually different types of context people tend to talk about when analyzing speech in specific situations. For example, context can refer to situational context. In other words, the visual or audio information in the speaking context. This could include gestures, gaze, intonation, speakers, who they are, addressee, who they are, or any other participants. Situation context also refers to time, place, or location of the speaker or the hearer. Context can also refer to shared background and cultural knowledge. For example, experiences with culture-specific norms, practices, fads, etc. People we know, times in our shared history. For example, if I say, don't forget to pick her up at 4 p.m. to my friend, I don't have to use the name of my friend, the person who is to be picked up. My friend will know who this pronoun her refers to because of our shared background and knowledge. Another very important context is the discourse context. So discourse context specifically refers to what has been said or written so far, or what reference have been mentioned in the current speech context. For example, in English, we can use determiners, indefinite determiners or articles to refer to a new referent. In this example you see here, a woman in a red hat started dancing. A woman and a new hat. These references usually refer to something new. Alternatively, this same event can be described as the woman in the red hat started dancing. A definite article the can be used to refer to an entity that has been mentioned in a previous discourse context. So how do children learn to choose the right forms of words and sentence structures to suit the communicative context? In terms of the forms of words, especially arguments or the forms of nouns, speakers could have the option of at least 3 options. The full lexical forms, such as the cat, the woman, or a pronoun, such as it, or you can just drop the argument completely. This is very common for pro-drop languages, such as Mandarin Chinese. You can simply omit the subject or the object if this form has been mentioned before. In terms of sentence structures or word order, speakers could choose different orders, right? They could choose SVO, the dog chased the cat, or OSV, as for the cat, the dog chased it. As I mentioned, discourse context impacted how we choose forms of nouns and word order in specific speech context. What has already been said or written becomes accessible in the minds of speakers and hearers, right, from a language processing perspective. So accessibility refers to the activation of an entity in the mental model of the discourse of the speakers and the hearers. Old entity is an entity that is accessible or available in the minds of the speakers or hearers. New entity refers to an entity that's less accessible. So to illustrate this point a little bit further, so here's a very short context, discourse context. What is dog doing? It is chasing the cat. Or you could say X or is chasing the cat. You can drop the subject since it's already been mentioned in the sentence, what is the dog chasing? So old entity is the entity that is accessible or available in the minds of speaker or hearers. Therefore, when we answer a question like, what is dog doing? We can either use a pronoun or we can just omit the subject, for example, in languages like Chinese. So noun forms usually refer to a new entity, and old entities tend to be labeled using a pronoun or a now or zero form. Similarly, in this example, you can see John is looking at garden. in his garden, the dog is chasing the cat, right? So the word order, the prepositional phrase his garden can be used to show the old entity versus the new entity. In other words, in terms of word order, people may want to choose a word order old entities before new entities. So in this project, we looked specifically at a very broad question, right? How do speakers adapt their utterances to the context? Do children, like adults, select the forms of nouns and word order based on accessibility and maybe other processing factors? So in terms of speakers, we examined adults and children speaking different languages, German, Mandarin, Hindi, Arabic, and English. In terms of adaptation of their utterances, we focused on word order and also the argument realization, the forms of their nouns. In terms of context, we looked at accessibility in particular, and also one study that I'm going to mention briefly, it also looked at other processing factors. Okay, so our specific research questions. Is children's language influenced by the accessibility of entities? Do children use an old before new word order? In other words, do children mention the accessible entity first? Do children use pronouns or null forms for old entities? In other words, do they mention the accessible entity with a reduced form? Okay, so the first set of studies explored the influence of accessibility on word order. So previous studies has shown some ordering preferences in adults. Adult speakers prefer to mention accessible or old entities earlier than non-accessible or new entities. Clark and Clark have argued that this preference is possibly a linguistic universal. In other words, speakers of all languages, regardless of your language, tend to place old entities before new entities in their speech. What about children? Earlier studies have shown children may prefer old before new. Other studies, for example, Bates 1976 study, show that children may prefer new before old word order. Bates and McWhiney's study also showed there may be no significant ordering preference in child speech. So our project, we investigated word order preference in a very specific construction, conjunct noun phrases, for example, a spoon and a ball. We chose this construction because this is a very simple and familiar construction for children. This construction is also very easy to manipulate in experiments. We can manipulate, and we did manipulate which noun was accessible, meaning being old, by mentioning it in the previous context. So for example, you can see here a ball in a container. You can describe this as, if you are asked what's in the box, the answer could be a ball, or a ball is in a box. And then if you're presented with a ball and a spoon right afterwards, what's in the box? Then you can say a ball and a spoon are in a box. If you answer this question with this word order, you are showing a old before new word order because a ball has been mentioned previously. So it's old relatively to the spoon. Or you could answer this question as a spoon and the ball are in a box. If you answered with this conjunct phrase, you are showing a new before old word order because a spoon is a new entity that's just been introduced, and the ball is an old entity that was introduced earlier. So we looked into different languages. The first set of studies 1, 2, 3, investigated German-speaking children and adults, how they describe these relations in conjunct noun phrases. And studies 4 to 6 looked at the same question, but in 3 different languages, English, Mandarin, and Arabic. The first 3 studies actually were conducted by my colleagues, Narasiham and Dimroth, because these studies form the foundation of studies 4 and 6. So I'm going to walk you through their studies first, and then we can talk about the cross-linguistic extension more easily. Okay, so study 1, ordering preferences in child and adult speakers of German. Children and adults played a game where they had to name pairs of objects. We had 24 adult German speakers and 2 groups German-speaking children, 3-year-olds, 16 children, mean age 3 years, 7 months, and 5-year-old German-speaking children, also 16 of them, mean age 5 years, 5 months. So here's the procedure of the experiment. The child was playing a game with an experimenter who covered his eyes and cannot see what's in a container. So we presented the child with a container that is transparent with an object inside it. Then the experimenter who covered his eyes asked, "What's in there?" The child is supposed to answer, "A ball." And then the experimenter who covered his eyes repeats exactly what the child has said. "Oh, a ball." By repeating this noun phrase, we are making this entity old, right? Because in discourse context, this entity has been mentioned, so it's been activated and more accessible. And then we show the child a new object in the transparent container together with the ball. And then we asked, "What's in there?" The child then is supposed to say a ball and a spoon, or a spoon and a ball, depending on which conjunct noun phrase the child produces. We can see which word order the child is producing. New before old, as in a ball and a spoon, or new before old, a spoon and a ball. The stimuli are 24 objects grouped into 12 pairs, and they are counterbalanced. We controlled for the following: animacy, only inanimate objects were included. We also controlled the weight of the object labels. These nouns were matched on their syllable length. Also, the gender of the nouns were also matched. The pair of objects bear the same gender in each trial. The frequency of the nouns was also matched. We also avoided fixed collocations such as bread and butter. The attractiveness of those objects were also controlled. As you can see in the example, these objects are also very common, mundane, daily physical objects in a child's life. We also included some distractor items, which are object pairs where both objects are new. Okay, so this graph shows you the results of the ordering preferences in children and adults. As you can see, obviously adults preferred old before new. This blue bar indicates about 70 to 75% of the word order produced by adults was old before new. If you look at children, we see a very different picture. Both the 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds produced more new before old word order, as these 2 red bars indicate. They don't show a preference of old before new. So the results of our data suggest new before old pattern or new before old strategy seems to be preferred by German-speaking children, at least age 3 years, and 4-year-olds. So why do children prefer this new before old word order? Maybe because caregivers or parents use the new old order when they talk to children, and children just imitate this order. So to test this hypothesis, we rerun the same study with adult caregivers. These are parents of children aged 2 years, 3 months to 6 years. These are all native speakers of German. So the procedure is very similar. We asked adults to talk about what's in the container as if they are talking to their own child. So this is the result of the preference in the caregiver speech. As you can see, the caregivers also produce dominantly old before new word order. So obviously the hypothesis was not proven. In other words, the preference for old before new word order remains even in child direct speech. So the third study investigated when children become more adult-like in their word order usage. So this study replicated the previous study with 16 9-year-old children acquiring German. And here with 9-year-olds, we see there is a change or a shift, right? You can see the 9-year-olds preferred old before new. About 65% of them in their usage, they used old before new word order. Okay, so just to show you, put all these studies together, do children use an old before new word order? Do they mention the accessible entity first? In our study of German children, we found no. The ordering of old and new entities depends on age. The new old preference wins in younger children, maybe because of novel entity effect. The old before new preference wins in older children, 9 years and above, and adults. They mention more accessible entities first. So why do children prefer the new old word order, which is opposite to the preference found in adults? As I've suggested, children's word order may be influenced by a cognitive bias for novelty. Children may pay more attention to a new entity. It's new, it's interesting, therefore they looked at it more. Maybe children mention first whatever they found interesting or they look at first. Studies have shown that children are more influenced by novelty than adults. So is the new before old word order a deep-rooted cognitive bias in children learning all languages? Or do word order preferences vary across children learning different languages? To explore these questions, we investigated word order preference in conjunct noun phrases in children learning English, Mandarin, and Arabic. So these are our studies number 4 to 6. Okay, so word order in English. Let's start with English first. So we conducted a very similar procedure based on Narasimhan and Dimroth's study. We presented conjunct objects that can be described with conjunct noun phrases on the computer lab in a slideshow. The participants of the study included 15 4-year-olds and 15 adult English speakers. And we had 12 target pairs of English nouns for 24 inanimate common objects. And the procedure is very similar. We presented the first object on the screen, and the experimenter asked what's on the screen. The participant is supposed to answer an apple, and then the experimenter repeats an apple. And then we present the second object together with the first object. What do you see on the screen? Then the participant is supposed to answer, I saw an apple and a pencil, or a pencil and an apple. So either a old before new word order or new before old word order. So this is a graph that shows you the mean proportions of new old and old new responses in English child and adult speech. As you can see in the adult speech, the blue bar represents the old before new strategy. Overwhelmingly, English adults used old before new word order, whereas children, they show a slightly different picture. We see about 60% of the children's responses are new before old, about 40% old before new. We run a mixed effects logistic regression and found there's a significant effect of age. Adults were more likely to use the old before new word order than children. Adults' preference for the old before new word order preference was also significantly higher than chance. Children did not prefer the new before old order at levels significantly higher than chance. So in other words, children do not show a significantly ordering preference, either new before old or before new. Okay, so how about Mandarin learning children? So we did a very similar study with Mandarin children. We had 24 4-year-olds of Mandarin speaking children and 15 adults. We also, in our stimuli, we had 12 target pairs of Mandarin nouns, and the procedure is very similar to our English study. And The analysis is also similar. We focused on their word order in their conjunct noun phrases. So this graph shows you the mean proportions of new, old versus old new responses in Mandarin children and adult speech. As you can see, clearly adults preferred old before new, whereas children show a chance level preference for either new before old or old before new. And our statistical analysis reveals a significant effect of age. Children were significantly less likely to use the old before new order compared with adults. Children also did not show a preference for the new before old word order. Okay, so how about Arabic? We had actually two groups of children in our Arabic study. We had 4-year-olds, 18 in the 4-year-olds and 18 6-year-olds, as well as 18 adults in the Arabic study. We also, in our stimuli, we had 12 target trials. We presented participants, child-friendly versions of the stimuli where the objects were presented by Mickey Mouse. Okay, so this graph shows you the mean proportions of new before old and old before new responses in Arabic child and adult speech. As you can see, the 4-year-olds dominantly used new before old word order. Interestingly, by age 6, we see there's a switch. So the 6-year-olds Arabic speaking children switch to old before new, but not yet quite adult-like. So in other words, we do see a developmental change happening around 6 years of age in the Arabic data. All right, to summarize this set of study, we found that old before new strategy is not a global preference. Adults in all 4 languages we have studied, adults preferred the old before new word order. In other words, adults prefer to mention more accessible reference first. In children, accessibility influenced word order patterns in 3 to 6-year-old children differently across languages. In German and Arabic, children preferred new before old word order. These children tend to mention new entity first. Whereas in English and Mandarin, we didn't find any preference for either new before old or old before new word order. Our study also shows children's non-adult-like word order preference is not a imitation of child-directed speech. The old before new preference has been argued to be a discourse universal, as I mentioned earlier, and is also being argued as a cognitive principle by which integration of new information is easier if framed within old information. Children's difference from the adults in their preference for the word order seems to suggest that they are still in a process of developing the discourse pragmatic sensitivity and competence to facilitate the integration of information in an adult-like manner. And when does this developmental change happen? Our data suggests sometime between 5 and 9 years of age. In our Arabic data, it shows around 6 years of age. In the German data, it's around 9 years. So what changes in this time window of time? So that's probably for future research. All right, I also want to mention a study, more recent study that we looked at processing factors on word order and syntax choice beyond just accessibility, right? So a number of processing factors have been widely studied in terms of how they influence syntax choice. Conceptual accessibility, for example, due to animacy, imageability, givenness, higher activation accessibility due to recent mention, as you have seen in my word order studies earlier I mentioned. The weight of noun phrases, for example, shorter phrases are easier to plan and produce. Maybe that would impact the choice of word order. Or syntactic priming due to prior occurrence. So we want to look at syntactic variation specifically in Mandarin in terms of two word orders. So Mandarin by default has SVO word order, subject, verb, object order. For example, 他吃完了煎饼. He ate up the pancakes. Or we could say 他把煎饼吃完了. He 把 the object and the verb phrase, right? So both constructions, the SVO word order and the SOV bar construction, are quite common in Mandarin Chinese. So we want to see which factors influence speakers' syntactic choice. In other words, the likelihood of using a bar construction versus using the default SVO word order in child and caregiver speech in Mandarin. So the factors that we have coded and examined include givenness, animacy of object and piece, weight of object and piece, lexicosyntactic priming. We want to find out how these factors influence speakers' syntactic choice in children versus adults. And our data came from longitudinal naturalistic a Mandarin-speaking child tone from age 1 year 7 months to 3 years 4 months. This corpus has monthly recordings, a total of 22 transcripts. We extracted 4,754 total utterances, coded for 332 verbs in terms of the word order, subject, verb, object versus subject, object, verb bar constructions. We coded age, child versus adults, features of object and piece, given versus new, animacy, so animate versus inanimate, weight of object and piece, and syntactic priming of prior use. So prior use is defined as 10 utterances before the target line. Logistic regression analysis was conducted to examine the role of the above factors on speaker syntactic choice. Okay, so these are the results. These are the graphs that show you the effects of the variables we analyzed, age, interactions of givenness and syntactic priming, givenness and animacy, and age and weight of the NPs. Just to give you the overall results here, we found that adults produced significantly more bar construction than the child, as you can see in the first graph here. We also found that the same processing factors play similar roles influencing adult and child Mandarin speakers' syntactic choice in spontaneous child-caregiver interactions. Significantly more bar constructions were produced in the bar before context than the no bar before context for given versus new reference, which suggests that there is some structural priming effects supporting prior experimental research on the influence of syntactic priming in child language and studies of the use of the bar constructions in adult Mandarin written corpora and recent experimental studies of Mandarin children. We also found significantly more bar constructions with inanimate MPs than animate MPs when the reference are given than when they are new, suggesting an interaction between animacy and information status of the NPs. In terms of length of NPs, we found the length may play a role in speakers' syntactic choice, as suggested by prior findings of the use of bar constructions in adult Mandarin spoken and written context. Okay, so the last set of study looked at the influence of accessibility on the forms of nouns, how arguments are realized as an effect of processing factors such as accessibility. Is children's language influenced by the accessibility of entities? So here we asked, do children use pronouns or noun forms for old entities? In other words, do they mention the accessible entity with a reduced form, such as a pronoun or a noun form? As we have seen that entities can be realized using different forms of nouns, right? We could use lexical noun, such as the dog, or a pronoun, it, or just drop this reference that's been mentioned, right? This is particularly common in Mandarin Chinese. zero form. Lexical phrases or nouns usually refer to new entities, right? And old reference or accessible entities tend to be more likely labeled with reduced forms such as pronoun and noun forms, as I just mentioned. Prior research on accessibility and argument realization has shown that accessible or old entities tend to be encoded with reduced forms such as pronouns or noun forms. Very young children are similar to adults. They use reduced forms to talk about accessible or old entities. For example, Clancy's studies of Korean children follow this pattern, and Allen's study of Inuktitut children, they also seem to follow this adult-like pattern. How about children learning other languages? To address this question, we looked at caregiver and child speech in Mandarin Chinese. Do caregivers and children learning Mandarin Chinese prefer null or zero forms for accessible or old entities? We looked at two children. The first child tone from the tone corpus from age 1 year 7 months to 3 year 4 months, and the pan from the Taiwan corpus Mandarin Chinese from age 1 year 7 months to 3 years 9 months. Okay, so this graph shows you the results of our analysis. The punchline is, just like their caregivers, young Mandarin learning children use null zero forms mainly for accessible old entities. As you can see, the blue bars are very high. These are zero forms, proportion of zero forms used by the children and the caregivers when they refer to old or accessible entities. Whereas you can see the non-accessible entities, or in other words, new entities, rarely do children and adults encode them with null or zero forms. So my colleagues also looked at another language, Hindi-speaking children, a corpus study of 12 Hindi-speaking children addressing the same question. Do caregivers and children learning Hindi prefer null, zero, and pronoun forms for accessible entities? So these children age range from 2 years, 10 months to 4 years, 3 months. This data also longitudinal naturalistic speech these are interactions of children with caregivers in their homes or outdoors. As you can see, similar finding was found with children acquiring Hindi. They also prefer null or zero forms or pronouns for accessible entities versus lexical forms. As you can see, when they talk about when they use lexical forms, very rarely do lexical forms used to refer to accessible or old entities. Zero or pronominal forms are more often in both adult and child speech to refer to entities that are old or accessible. All right, so is children's language influenced by the accessibility of entities? Do children use pronouns or noun forms for old entities? Our data suggests yes, children prefer to use reduced forms for old entities, which shows that children are sensitive to the influence of accessibility on noun forms, similarly to their adult counterparts. Do children use an old before new word order? Do they mention the accessible entity first? No. Young children prefer the new before old word order, as shown in our data of German and Arabic learning children. These children are sensitive to accessibility, but may have a non-adult-like cognitive bias for novelty. For languages like English and Mandarin, our data suggests also no, children do not have a preference for old before new. Mandarin and English children they show no preference for either word order, which suggests in some languages, children may take longer to develop adult-like uses of word order to distinguish old versus new entities. In general, children acquire adults-like use of noun forms earlier than word order to distinguish old versus new entities. Some future directions along these lines of research. How does accessibility influence word order and argument realization over the course of childhood? Do individual children differ in their sensitivity to accessibility? How do children develop awareness of what the learner, the hearer knows and adapt their speech accordingly? What kinds of word orders do caregivers employ in child-direct speech? To conclude all the studies I have presented here today, these are take-home messages. Children are sensitive to language-specific semantic categorizations from an early age. Children are sensitive to discourse pragmatic constraints and processing factors that influence word order, syntactic choice, and argument realization. Developmental changes towards adult-like usage can take some time. Lastly, but not the least, I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators over the years. I'd like to thank them for their contribution and hard work. Thank you. And I also like to call everybody's attention for a special issue that I'm editing with Dr. Yasuhiro Shirai. This special issue features East Asian perspectives on the acquisition of argument structure. So if you are working on this topic, please consider submitting your manuscript to this special issue. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chen, for your insightful and thought-provoking talk. My first impression is that the content in your talk was really rich and engaging. Thank you all for this.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So before we move on to the Q&A session, please allow me to briefly summarize the main points of your lecture, and please feel free to correct me if I've missed or misunderstood anything, okay? Yes, you may have a drink some water or coffee. So in today's lecture, Professor Chen presented a series of studies examining how language shapes cognitive categorization and linguistic choices, particularly in relation to event descriptions and word order. So the lecture firstly begins with an overview of 4 mini mappings in child language, including the foundational challenges such as the GAVA-gap problem, the categorization problem, and faster mapping. Then Professor Chen delved into event categorization as a case study for understanding the mechanisms behind faster mapping. 2 key findings: children several years, often 6 or more, to learn to attend to adult-like semantic feature sets and to assign appropriate weights to these features. And secondly, although children rely on powerful learning mechanisms to extract categorization patterns from highly variable inputs, later development is gradual and involves substantial restructuring of semantic space. And then in the third part of today's lecture, Professor Chen explored how accessibility influences word order. Her research examined how information status, specifically the old versus new information, affects word order preferences in both children and adults, with a focus on German and Mandarin. The findings show that children tend to prefer a new before old order, which contrasts with the adult preference for old before new. This is the developmental shift that occurs over time. And finally, the talk addressed how accessibility also affects the morphological form of nouns, further illustrating the interplay between cognitive and linguistic factors in language acquisition. So thank you again, Professor Chen, for such a stimulating presentation. We are now entering the Q&A session. So firstly, Thomas, do you have any comments or questions?
Yeah, okay. First, I would like to express my great thanks to Professor Chen. So it is a great pleasure and enjoyment to have such a lecture in the early morning. Even though we are losing some audience because we started earlier, but we still have in the attention room, we have some 50 audience, and in the Zoom, we have some 30, right? But anyway, more audience will join in and later by watching the recordings. I ask a few questions, just give Professor Chen a longer breath of rest. Okay, first question is as follows. Semantically, cross-linguistically, there are any differences among the cutting, breaking, and tearing? In my understanding, from Chinese and English, cutting mainly emphasizes on the instrument, that we use a knife to cut something, to cut metal into two. But it can tolerance an extension, such as I can cut something using my hand. Now, breaking emphasizes on the result. That is, originally there's one object, then it was broken into two, or something like that. But tearing, in my understanding, originally two things was glued together or putting together. Then you put the originally two objects apart again into two objects. So that's my understanding gained from English and Chinese. And Professor Chen studied Zhao and Tamil and so on. Is there any other semantic factors which are really different from the Chinese and English? That's the first question. The second, by studying the acquisition of these kind of event categories, do we gain some kind of insights or reflections for the principles of cognitive linguistics, or to prove or confirm the basic principles of cognitive linguistics, or some kind of principles? Because this kind of acquisition studies, based on the cognitive linguistic framework. Third, the third question is more specific. I learned just now from your lecture, you said in the study of word order, that is, old and new is not a universal preference. And what kind of reflection can we gain from this conclusion to the well-established framework of figure and ground, long established in cognitive linguistics by Professor Lanterni? I hope I made myself clear. Thank you very much, Professor Chen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Liu, for summarizing my talk. And thank you very much, Professor Li, for your questions. These are great questions. I'll try my best to answer one by one. So the first question you asked is about the semantic features of cutting, breaking, tearing in other languages, right? So yeah, so actually these the features, right, that people or languages actually use to categorize cutting, breaking, at least more than 20 or 25 languages have been analyzed, but mostly in adult language, right? So in one of my colleagues' paper, Majid, 2010, she actually showed, right, how very diverse languages encode cutting, breaking, tearing in terms of this distinctive features, semantic features languages can care about, right? There's a long list of different features. For example, right, like in Mandarin, we care about instruments, right? So if it's cut with a knife, it's 切. If it's cutting with scissors, it's 剪, right? So instrument stands out in all the very diverse languages, right? So somehow cognitive, I think, right, how you break a thing, what instrument you are using matters. So that's why instrument stands out as like a very important semantic feature in the meanings of cutting, breaking, and tearing verbs. In addition to instruments, other features, right? For example, the manner, right? As Professor Lee mentioned, tearing. When you say tearing something, it involves a manner of pulling something away from or apart from something, right? So that's tearing. So manner of the cutting or breaking also stands out in the semantic dimensions that many languages actually care about. And also the physical properties of objects involved also play very important roles in languages like Zoto, right? As I mentioned in my talk, different verbs have to be used depending on whether this object is soft, flexible, or whether this object is longish or rigid, right? So there are a long list of semantic features, right? Different languages could choose, could vary, but overall, there seems to be some agreement on what are the most important semantic features that all languages care about, right? For example, in the 28 languages that Majid and colleagues analyzed, they show that the first dimension that captures the biggest, right, variation is actually tearing, right? When you tear something, there's no precise or precision of the breaking point. So that kind of dimension is featured in all the languages that she had looked at. Then, instruments and manner of cutting and breaking, right? These all stand out. And also, addressing Professor Lee's point on, right, cut verbs versus break verbs. Indeed, right, cutting verbs and breaking verbs, these verbs have been really analyzed significantly in linguistics, right? So cut verbs behave syntactically differently from break verbs. For example, you can say I cut the bread, but you cannot say the bread cut. But you could say I broke the bread and the bread broke, or I broke the steak broke, right? So Bess Levin's work has extensively studied, right, how the meanings of cut verbs and how the meanings of break verbs differ systematically, and that explains their syntactic behaviors, why break type of verbs can be used in the transitive frame and also in the inchoative frame, whereas cut verbs cannot, right? Cut verbs often only occur in the transitive active constructions. So I think that's my answer to your first question. And then the second question, you were asking about, right, the threat, I think is about the theoretical significance of looking into the acquisition of event categories, right? Event boundaries and categories of cutting, breaking, and tearing, right? I think, as I mentioned, right, this research, this line of research has the theoretical significance in trying to answer the basic question: what role does non-linguistic concepts play in children's learning of format meaning mappings, right? So for a long time, right, cognitive priority has been the emphasis, right? Children start with some kind of universal semantic space, especially in events that are so basic to human experiences, like prepositions, right? Spatial relations, in and on. So in the events like cutting and breaking, these are also universal human experiences, and children are exposed to, and children hear speech, language, talking about these events very early on, right? So the theoretical interesting issue then is, right, do children first build some concepts, right? The concepts or categories of concepts before they talk about these experiences, right? So the cognitive priority hypothesis argue that children have some universal semantic categories before they talk about these events. Then when they are talking about these events, they are mapping the language forms onto their cognitive concepts, which they already established through their experiences with the world, right? So this line of argument can be traced back all the way to, for example, Piaget, right? Children go through similar sensory motor stage. Their exploring of the world is similar, regardless of cultures, regardless of their exposure of different languages, right? So similar cognitive experience may, forms a foundation for children's cognitive conceptual development. And then when they are learning a language, then, language learning may be seen as a process of mapping this pre-established cognitive concepts onto the language-specific forms, right? So that's one theoretical view. And then the other view I was trying to actually support or argue for is the alternative view, right? Which argues basically, there may not be a universal semantic category pre-established through cognitive development first, and then we map our language onto these concepts, right? So in this view, as championed by many researchers before me, for example, Melissa's work, she argued, right, it's unlikely to have this universal semantic categories first and then map language onto these concepts, right? Because if you look at languages, these categories, linguistic category, is so diverse, and how semantic information is packaged into specific forms is so language specific. It's impossible to have some pre-established conceptual space developed before language acquisition happens, right? So this view argues, right, this has to be an interaction, right? You are a child, very young child, infant, is building a conceptual representation of the world. Meanwhile, he's learning language. So these two routes actually interact. In other words, there's no such a thing as a pre-established universal semantic categories in space the child build first and then map language onto it. In other words, while the child is building this conceptual world or cognitive representation of relations, they are influenced by the language, how language partition the semantic space, how language packaging this information into words, phrases, and sentences. So it's an interactive relation. It doesn't pre-assume, right? There has to be a universal pre-established conceptual category before they can map some words onto this form. So that's I think my answer to the second question about, what can we learn from research into children's acquisition of event categories, right? So here I only reported studies of cutting and breaking events. A lot of other events have been looked at, right? Spatial domain, looking at prepositions, even for objects, right? If you think about objects, when we use nouns, nouns refer to categories of reference, right? So how do children know this rabbit is a rabbit, right? Rabbits can differ in color, shape, as I illustrated, right? How, what's a cup? What's a mug? What's a plate? What can be called a bowl, right? So there are all different kind of nuances, in how you use words to linguistically categorize the objects around you and also the events around you, right? So I think this line of research, into object categories or event categories, different types of event categories, right, is a very rich field. We have seen a lot of cross-linguist research in the past, I would say 3 decades, right? Motion events, spatial relations, cutting breaking events. So cutting breaking events is just one of the many event types, basic human experiences that have been investigated in terms of how these events are described in different languages. Okay, the third question, I think Professor Lee was asking about word order, right? Speakers' preferences for different word orders, new before old or old before new, right? How does this line of research relates to cognitive semantics, for example, Dunning-Kruger's framework, like figure and ground? I think that's a very interesting question. I think because our study looked very specifically at word order, right? And in relation to information structure, right? I can only speak for how, pragmatic knowledge or situations or constraints can impact language usage, right? So here we're talking about the actual language usage. When people are using language, they don't, choose forms or word order randomly, right? Their subconscious process of choosing certain forms of words or certain word order actually reflects their pragmatic knowledge about the situation, right? If something has been mentioned, then I don't have to say the full noun phrase the next time when it's mentioned again, right? And in Chinese, this is especially true if you already talk about the dog, previously, then you just omit that noun phrase, right? Just don't need a form to refer back to it. Um, so, so what I want to show here is that when we are using a language, right, you are not just bound by grammatical rules, you are also bound by the information structure, the context, shared ground, common knowledge, shared common ground, etc. Right? So these kind of information in the speech context all play a role in speakers' choice of the forms, right? Linguistic forms. And from a cognitive perspective, I think this can review, right, how information is accessed, right? As I talk about accessibility, right? Entities being mentioned before is more accessible, right? Because they're activated and they are recent. Therefore, it's more likely, in a discourse, people want to mention old before new, right? As a natural flow in terms of cohesion, easier. I would say recipient design, how easy for your recipient to understand you, right? So subconsciously, speakers are following all this, cognitive, we say cognitive constraints to adapt their speech, so it's easier for listeners to understand. So I hope I answered Professor Lee's.
Thank you very much. It's quite clear.
Thank you.
A further question, Prof, out in understanding your first question. The cutting is a general category, and we have language-specific question like a Caesar, like a hack. Have you encountered any kind of language-specific cutting events, sub-events in studying the 28 languages?
Yeah, so like cutting with scissors or cutting with blade. So I think English uses basically a very broad verb, right? Cut, right? It doesn't matter whether it's single blade or double blades, right? Or Mandarin cares whether it's single blade or double blade. But this is not unique to Mandarin. Dutch, for example, also has two verbs. One verb is I think snijden. It means to cut with scissors, and then there's another verb klippen. It means to cut with blade. Okay, so that's why theoretically speaking, when you look at diversity of language, right, which feature, right, a language chooses in terms of encoding, cutting, breaking, I would say sometimes it can be seen very arbitrary, right? So Mandarin cares about double versus single play. Dutch also cares about it, but Dutch and Mandarin are completely different languages, right? So in a way, when you think about the cognitive representation of these events, there are all kinds of things you can care about, right? Instrument, manner, object features, the orientation of the objects, or all kinds of real world physical properties of objects and events, right? You can care about, right? So there could be an infinite long list of features that languages could potentially care about. But if you look at specific languages, right? Languages, there are a few, right? It's a limited number of features that one language will choose to care about, and another language. And in between languages, you see overlap, right? So that's why when we run the analysis across those languages, you'll see, oh, some dimensions, right? Dimension 1 and 2 tend to capture the most variance across languages. In other words, dimensions 1 and 2 capture more the features that most language would care about, right? So in a way, see, we have all these potential features languages could care about, and which features a language chooses. In a way, I think it's kind of arbitrary, right? So that's why, the alternative view I mentioned earlier, right? It argues that lexical categories do not really reflect shared non-linguistic cognition directly, but are to some extent linguistic conventions that are free to vary according to, for example, historical, cultural, and environmental circumstances to some degree.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chen. I have to give the floor back to our chairperson. Hello, Leonard.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Chen, for your detailed answer. Very informative and very insightful. Personally speaking, I have a question regarding the developmental timeline of event categorization when you introduce the conclusions. Because I have a daughter who is now 1 year and 8 months, so I'm not expecting her to speak out the cutting or breaking verbs. So you mentioned that in your study or from the series of studies, it takes children up to maybe 6 years or more to learn to attend to adult-like semantic feature sets. So what factors among the various factors do you think most significantly influence the pace of this development?
Good question. First of all, 1 year, 8 months is a fun age. It's a great age to observe language development, right? Because that's when the child starts to produce sentences. So all the fun things are happening. So enjoy. Regarding your question about factors that influence, right, children's development in terms of semantics or verbs categorizations, the general suggestion is, right, the diversity of verbs a child can produce or understand, to a large extent, can depend on the input the child receives, right? So we always, see a child output is a reflection of the input, right? If you look at analysis of child language data, especially longitudinal data, oftentimes you see a very like a mirror image of the child's production with the adult's language production, right? So that means to help, right, in a way to help a child's language development, say, my child hasn't been talking about cutting and breaking, should I be worried? Usually, right, you want to have lots of, we say, quality and quantity input, right, to provide large number of diverse words and high frequency usage of these words that could help a child to output, right? So because of this, long-standing finding of the close relationship between input and output, right? To help a child to acquire a language, we say faster, right? In terms of speed, in terms of diversity of vocabulary, good quality, quantity, high quantity of input matters, right? Probably, there has been a lot of research to show individual differences in language development, right? So usually we'll say, okay, let's look at healthy children. Healthy children learn to speak, produce their first words around age 1, right? So, but this is, as the graph I showed you at the very beginning, that's a very rough timeline, right? Underneath that development, there is a huge human, we say individual variation, and a lot more recent research actually has shown more individual variation, right? It's not like, okay, this is a universal pattern, all healthy children develop in a similar way. No. Recent research actually has shown there is so much more individual variation than we had thought before, right? So even within children in the same cultural environment, right? For example, children learning a language in a middle-class family in China or in America, right? Even in a very similar cultural environment, there is still individual variation in children's language. So in my data, I haven't got time to talk about individual variation, right? In the word order preference, for example, we actually found, right, even though overall average out, right, Mandarin children did not show old before new preference in our experiment. But if you look at individual level, some children actually preferred old before new overall, whereas a lot of children didn't, right? So that kind of averaged out, and then you see there's no preference, right? So individual variation does exist. And in a way, from a parent's point of view, right? How can I help my child to learn to develop a language faster, right? Provide quality input in large quantity. I always say that's the way to go.
Yes, Exactly, the individual variation is very important because it shows the tendency rather than the absolute rule we follow. Okay, and a second question that comes to my mind is exactly about the shift from new before old and old before new. In your introduction of the study, I found that when we try to explain the developmental shift in children or in mainly in the children in the child, is it primarily driven by increased exposure to discourse patterns? Because for the caregivers, babysitters, when they speak to babies or speak to children, they may firstly speak out the new information to put emphasis on it, and then some old information. We know this happened a lot of time. Or do you think the phenomenon, the shift, reflects the broader cognitive changes in processing accessibility and information structure? Actually, I'm wondering whether we can say the two important factors, they they affect the old or new before old or old before new, one by one, which one precedes the other, or they actually have their effects on children simultaneously, do you think? What do you think of
Yeah,
it?
I think probably I'm just speculating because we haven't run empirical studies on this, right? So
Mhm.
I think potentially, right, hearing adults producing old before new word order a lot more, right? 3-year-olds versus 6-year-olds, right? 3 more years hearing adults using old before new probably will have an effect, right, in moving children from new before old to old before new word order, right? So I would think there will be an effect, right? Because in our data, we have shown that adults, right, they all prefer old before new. Um, and so I would think there will be an input effect, right? Hearing adults talk about old before new for more years, that could have an impact, right? And another factor um, I think could be also written language in addition to oral language, right? By age 6 and above, right? Children already start to learn to read and write. And in written language, you will see coherent text, right? They follow this principle, right? Old before new, right? To achieve coherence. For example, say, I'm at Johnny's garden. In his garden, he has a lot of flowers, right? So you can see this kind of usage a lot in written text, right? When children start to learn to read and write, and then they are also receiving input, right? A lot of input from written language, which kind of shift them to old before new as well. So yeah.
Yes, the differentiation between the spoken and the written form makes a lot of sense. Yeah,
Mhm.
actually, when we try to delve into the old before new or new before old patterns of the children's output. Thank you, because I'm also now trying to conducting a longitudinal study on the language production of my daughter.
Mhm.
I tried to, yes, record our spoken data when I play with her
Mhm.
daily. So I hope I can get some interesting results and share with you later about
That'd be
it.
wonderful. Yeah. As right, as a language acquisitionist, we all do experiments on our children, right? Poor children. I actually recorded my children's language development from very young age, from
Mhm,
age like pre-linguistic to like about age 3. Yeah.
mhm.
Unfortunately, they learn English. I want more data from, from Mandarin learning children, but unfortunately, my kids are mostly English speaking, so there's plenty of English
Data.
data already, so they don't need more English data. But I
In-
did record my children from like, 6 months or, all the way up to like 3 years.
Interesting.
Right.
Okay, thank you for sharing. And also, I noticed that we have a question from the viewers in Tencent meeting that he or she asks, do Chinese children differentiate between the RVC, maybe the resultative verb compounds, the Chinese resultatives, and the first V1, when describing a breaking event? Maybe whether the Chinese children prefer use the resultative constructions or just the verb or the single verb construction?
Yeah, actually, children used both, but mostly resultive verb constructions, right? Because in our video, right, our video clips, they present a clear action and a clear result, right? So that's why in our illustration, children actually mostly they will want to capture both, right? Both the action and the result. So we got lots of resultive verb compounds. In some cases, we did see just one verb, right? The action verb, or in some cases, just one result verb, right? So those happen too, but I don't have the exact numbers. But overall, Chinese children produce lots of resultive verb compounds similar to the adults, right? I think that's
Mhm.
because, right, our stimuli show a clear action and a clear result, right? To capture both sub-events, you will have to use a resultive verb compounds. And 4-year-olds, 4.5-year-olds, they are already pretty cognitively mature to process these events. So we saw a lot of resultive verb compounds, but occasionally we can see some children produce just one verb, either an action verb or just a result verb. That happens too, yeah, depending on the perspectives, right? So if the action, somehow is more attractive to the child, maybe he will just describe that part of the event. Maybe the resultant state is somehow stands out to that particular child, then the child will just say, 断了 or 破了, right? So
Yeah.
just to describe the resultant part. Yeah, so both happen, but mostly resulting verb compounds.
Very interesting finding. Actually, I conducted a similar research. That is, I collected the elicitation data for the cause, especially the caused motion event in Mandarin. But my participants are all adults, and I then coded the sentence patterns and the construction patterns they used. I found that for some adults, they describe the whole events in a fine-grained manner. So they may introduce the cause, the result, use the serial verb construction or resultative verb construction or bar construction, etc. A lot of variants. And also for the others, they maybe only pay attention to the causing event or the resulting event, just like you said that some of them only describe the resulting event, 破了,断了,走了,关了,开了, etc. So this depends on the individual difference, because some people try to describe in a coarse-grained manner, where rather try to describe in a fine-grained manner. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, there is individual variation, right, in their perspectives on those events. But usually, because we want to see they're talking about the whole events, right? Both sub-events. So that's why oftentimes, especially with children, when we do such illustrations, we would tell the child, right? Oh, there's, another person who cannot see this video. You have to describe to him or her what exactly you have seen, right? So we're trying to get like as complete description of what's actually happened in the clip as possible, right?
Yes,
So
exactly.
sometimes people just focus on one sub-event. Yeah, that
Yes.
happens too. Yeah.
Okay, so a second question from Tencent Meeting. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. And are you considering that the children's choices are affected by usage? Because usually we see the usage-based event. I mean, usage is a variable which develops, grows through time, thus exercising an ever-increasing impact and weight on the kids towards the schema and patterns used by the adults. Do you have any clues to this factor?
Oh, so I assume this is a question about the cutting and breaking events. So how usage may affect the children's choices.
Usage.
Okay, so if this question refers to the cutting and breaking events, right? Talking about usage, how usage can impact children's choice of verbs to describe these events. Um, I think usage may have impact, but not heavily, because the semantics of cutting and breaking or tearing verbs, right? They have specific semantic features that basically govern the usage of these verbs, right? If it's cutting with scissors, then you have to say 剪, right? You cannot say 切. So the semantics of the verbs itself basically kind of governs, right, which verb you should be using to describe these events. But when there are synonyms you could use to describe the same events, right? For example, you could use, I don't know, I can't come up with an example, but there will be events where you could use multiple verbs, right? Synonyms to describe the same events, right? In those cases, yes, usage will play a role, right? So the verbs that you heard most frequently from your input will be the verbs you're more likely to output, right? So there may be some usage effect in the input that could impact your choice of words, right? But in terms of just the verbs itself, I think because these verbs, right, have their own semantic very well-defined semantic features, and therefore when you're using these verbs, right, you have to follow those semantic features. But when there are possibilities of using different synonyms, right, to describe same events, then their usage may play some role.
Mhm.
Yeah, and also if the question is asking about word order usage, you know, whether children prefer old before new and new before old, I think usage especially usage in the adult pattern, right, in the adult language, doesn't seem to impact children's early language, right? Because we have seen, like, you know, German and English young children, they do not show adult-like patterns, even though adults use old before new in child direct speech, right? So in other words, usage is not the only thing that shapes language development. Um, in our studies, it's, you know, children's cognitive development interacts, right, with usage. So in a lot of times, cognition plays a role, and usage plays a role. A lot of times it's multiple factors, right, impact the language acquisition.
Yes, multiple factors counts. And then a follow-up question, especially again for the word order. So from Professor Liu Meili from Jianghan University, she says that thank you very much for the insightful talk. And in your study, you find that German and Arabic children show new before old word order in their acquisition, while Mandarin and English children indicate no preference. So she was wondering if this difference can be ascribed to the linguistic feature of the respective languages. And how do you account for this difference?
Very good question. English and Arabic are unrelated. They are topologically very different. Um, I don't know if it's because of you know, some linguistic similarities between these languages in using word order to talk about old versus new, or is it because of a possible difference, I think, in our methodology? So the English study, I would say our test is not as communicative as in the Arabic data. So in the Arabic situation, right, my student actually did the study, right? She actually had two experimenters running the study, right? One was running the slides and the other one was sitting against the laptop, so that person cannot see the screen, and therefore, you know, the child had to describe what he has seen on the screen to this person who cannot see the screen. So it's a more meaningful communicative context for the Arabic children when they're talking about these events. Whereas the English study, right, we only had one experimenter, and the slides showed the objects, right, and then children just talk about this event. So I think it's less communicative in the English study. So maybe this methodological difference plays some role in the in the word order preference for children, because in the English children's data, we didn't find a preference for either old before new or new before old. Whereas in the Arabic data, 6-year-olds, right, already switched to old before new, similar to the adults, right? So this could be a difference from the methodology, or it could also be something specific to the language in terms of how adults talk about old versus new in Arabic, which I don't think anybody has done this research, right? Looking at how child direct speech in Arabic is like in terms of word order, right? How adults actually order their old versus new when they are addressing children. So yeah, I don't have a definite answer to this question, but at least, right, this can be tested. It's empirically testable.
Yes, this is some very good ideas we can do in the future. So thank you all, Professor Chen. Thank you all for your input, and not only to the lecture, but also the detailed analysis in the Q&A session. Thank you. I think because it's almost 2 hours, and thank you for your hard work, and let's call it a day.
Thank you so much. I'm really thankful for everyone who got up early, asked me questions. This is really, I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
We also enjoyed your talk very much. So I will write to you later when we post the video recording on our YouTube channel as well as on our WeChat official platform. I will let you know.
Thank you.
Enjoy your day.
Enjoy your day. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good day.
Bye.